I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source on the new magic of money, or Muskism, as our guests call it. Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff, historians of different sorts, historians of the future, welcome back to this conversation. Oddly enough, this hair-raising book of yours is not really about the man Elon Musk or his famous money. It's about the sci-fi system that he is creating to trap the rest of us inside it. I think that's Jill Lepore's phrase. Techno sovereignty is the buzzword that rules the walled gardens of Musk World, private empires of far-reaching wealth and power. Musk himself models the new class of emperors. Funny part is that the last time we spoke, Elon Musk and his chainsaw were modeling just the opposite, his own ruthless, destructive power in the chaotic, post-democratic age of Donald Trump. A year and a half later, Donald Trump can look like a declining force compared with Elon Musk on the rise at the dawn of a settled down, largely secret, post-capitalist or neo-capitalist age of Elon Musk. I'm wondering, did you write your book, Muskism, to punctuate a transition from the short-lived age of Donald Trump to the Musk era of monster money? Quinn?
I'd be inclined to say no. In fact, when we last spoke, we were indeed in the midst of the Doge experiment. And from the outside, that looked to many people like an act of almost anarchism, that it was seeking to dismantle the government, tear up its institutions, root and branch. And yet, even with a few months hindsight, we see it in two different ways. One is that it did have that deletion aspect, that destructive aspect, but it was also more quietly integrating the government in new ways, getting rid of what they saw as the surplus of USAID and so on, but then also making parts of the government more legible to each other, making it queryable for new AI tools of the kind that Palantir has sold to the government to great profit since the beginning of the second Trump administration. So there was a productive, if less visible, part of the project, and there was a destructive side. But most interestingly, Musk actually failed by his own standards in the course of that project. The $2 trillion amounted to a small figure that was then, itself eclipsed by the One Big Beautiful Bill's tax cuts for the very wealthy. And Musk went out kind of having taken a hit in terms of popularity, and his mystique sort of had received a bit of a black eye, literally. So it seemed even then that the tech lord still kind of needs the old-fashioned politician to secure some kind of legitimacy and consent, and that balance hasn't quite been undone such that a Muskism could come along that meant the elimination of old-fashioned politics. In fact, Muskism works through this symbiotic fusion with old-fashioned politics.
Fusion, key word. We'll come back to fusion over and over, including the fusion of human beings, even human minds and machinery. Ben, I thought our last conversation and podcast said to me, stop thinking of this as a guy, as a person, a hugely wealthy, obviously, and powerful dude, but think of him as a system representing something, a force coming out of Silicon Valley, obviously, which we think of you as our man covering it. Where are we now, and what are we supposed to be learning about Muskism?
Well, I think the comparison between Trump and Musk is interesting in this respect, because since Trump appeared on the political scene at this point more than a decade ago, there have been all these efforts to theorize Trumpism. What is Trumpism? How do we give it some kind of systematic ideological content? And Trump himself has actually made it very difficult to theorize a Trumpism. Even now, into his second term, people are still struggling to find the kind of political coordinates of something called Trumpism. For us, Musk actually offers a much better handhold on the present era. And again, it's not that we're trying to make him appear more systematic or premeditated than he is. In fact, much like Trump, Musk appears to operate largely by improvisation, by intuition. Nonetheless, his life and career, when you look at the long arc of it over the last 40, 50 years, actually furnishes some fascinating materials towards thinking about a new kind of political economic paradigm that's emerging from these various currents that Musk himself interacts with and benefits from. Our bid is that Muskism is actually a much more productive concept for trying to figure out what the hell is going on right now than Trumpism or a number of the other isms that have been proposed in recent years.
For example, what does he explain that our more and more incoherent political coverage does not tell us? Quinn.
One of the seductive avenues that has been very popular in the last couple of years, especially last year, to understand what's going on in Silicon Valley is to do close readings of the kind of cookie crumbs that they leave out for us, the kind of pundit class, right? If we just study these close enough, put our humanities degrees to work, then somehow the logic of it will disclose itself. And we think that's actually really misguided, that in a way that's a distraction, almost a psyop that has been laid by the kind of tech leadership class. We think that you have to tell the intellectual history of Silicon Valley from inside the practice of capitalism. So Muskism for us is not, trying so much to understand, let's say, what Musk's memes mean, and more like trying to figure out what his memes do. Right? How do they work to build interest from investors? How does it work to give a sense of him as the person who can narrate the direction of growth for this or that sector? How does he win confidence through just the amassing of attention, regardless in a way of what those things are? And this becomes a really stark example when you look at the source base that we're working with here, right? Often the stuff that Musk is posting on Twitter and then X is outrageous, comical, and even childish, right? It'll be sort of photoshopped images of himself as the Lion King. And you look at that and you think, well, that's a joke. That must be meaningless. He must be wasting his time. Maybe he was on drugs when he posted this. But in fact, look at it twice and you see that he, through posting that goofy Lion King meme, was able to change the value of a cryptocurrency, right? From moment to moment. So in fact, the surface appearance or even the apparent content of it is not what we should pay attention to, but its function. In that case, he's performing an act of what we call attention alchemy. He's turning our fascination and our interest into a kind of a momentum that can build then confidence in him as someone who shows the path of the future growth world.
Decode a phrase that you use a lot in the book, that Muskism is the operating system of the 21st century.
It's a term that we deploy quite intentionally because when we're trying to think about Muskism, one of the core characteristics is that it is a machine-first view of human society. That Musk believes that the internet is the primary layer of reality and that everything is downstream of it. And it's worth pausing to consider how strange that notion is. Most of us would actually consider it the inverse, that things happen in the offline world, and then there are reflections or emanations that appear on the internet. For Musk, it's actually precisely the opposite, that the computer is the control module of the world, and that in turn is a theory of power, a theory of politics, because if you can control the correct cluster of computers, then you can reprogram the code base and in turn transform society. This is our understanding of Musk's meme politics, where for him, because he takes a very computational view of society, he also has a very computational view of what a human being is. That most human beings are, in his term, non-player characters, NPCs, which is a term from video games, essentially means folks that you interact with in a gaming environment who are programmable and programs. They're pieces of software. They're not real people. Therefore, if most human beings are programmed and programmable, you can reprogram them by introducing and propagating different kinds of memes, or as he literally calls it, borrowing a term from Richard Dawkins, mind viruses. So this is his theory, not just of the world, but how to change the world as well.
It's also worth maybe pointing out that part of the productive methodology here, we hope, is by taking his apparently outrageous beliefs so seriously. we expose a kind of startling riddle, which is, why is it that someone that has the kind of beliefs that Ben just laid out nonetheless been rewarded so fulsomely by the sober-minded global investment community, right? Why has that seeming delusion, or even almost some version of internet-induced psychosis, the belief that everything is online and the offline world is just a shadow or a reflection of it, nevertheless led to him being worth, over $800 billion. And that's one of the virtues of the biographical method as we see it, because where does he come up with these ideas? First, when he gets a Commodore programmable personal computer, which was indeed cutting edge technology in the 80s. Then when when he's a teenager. But shortly afterwards, he's in Silicon Valley in the late 1990s. And he says the internet is becoming the superset of all media. Everything will be folded into it. TV, radio, money. That's what PayPal is. And people kind of look at him and think, what a kooky kid. This kid's been, on his computer too much. But was he right more than he was wrong as far as a prediction of the direction of global capitalism went? Actually, he was. So even if you take those delusions as read, they would actually have a tremendous predictive capacity just for making money in the last 25 years, right? And that's part of the thing I think we find so interesting. Why is this mania so lucrative? How has that world been produced?
First thing I want to ask is, where does he think the core of reality was before there was an internet? I mean, where was it living until 30 years ago?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, it perhaps is one of the explanations of why he was so fascinated with kind of golden age science fiction and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because those provided a kind of premonition or prefiguration of the world that he would then hopefully help to bring about. And somehow the material world was never adequate, and he found his sense of spirituality, really, or metaphysics, in those books, which he then, oriented himself towards. But it would actually be an interesting question just to ask him directly. I've never thought about it.
In fact, on South African television in the 1980s, when Musk was young, they were showing shows like Robotech or Transformers, and these are cited by Musk in later years as an explicit influence. Even before the internet has become mainstream, Musk is fascinated with the prospects of merging with the machine. This notion of a kind of cyborg consciousness, a giant cybernetic collective, as he later describes it, is an enduring point of fascination for Musk long before the technology exists to make it more of a reality.
And it's maybe worth speculating that technology itself is the key word here, right? I mean, if we think about the computer as just the latest and most advanced form of a human relationship to the physical world, out of which comes tools that augment human capacity and thus give us an ever greater ability to manipulate and transform that physical world, then that, I think, is where you would find, the nexus of his belief system, say, before the Commodore itself came around. And you can see that captured well in, for example, the importance of the Prometheus myth for the tech leadership class.
Prometheus, who stole fire.
Fire from the gods, yeah.
And paid for it.
Yeah.
This is endlessly interesting about the man himself. He is an intellectual. He's a fierce reader. When he ran out of books, he read meticulously the great encyclopedias. He's thinking all the time. Born 1971 in South Africa, an apartheid system at its most rigidly divided and, of course, racist. He comes to California just in time for the dot-com boom of thinkers as well as companies. But it's in your book, I find a perfect capture of this Muskist insight. He was learning in the days of Peter Thiel and PayPal and the first explosion of both profits and transformative technology. He was learning how ideas could be turned into companies and companies into monopolies under conditions sustained by the state. The internet, invented for the Pentagon by DARPA, would turn everything into code, and Uncle Sam would finance this future. That's the other thing we forget clearly in your book, that he has been working with government, in government, with public money almost from the beginning. The internet would turn everything into code. Uncle Sam would finance this future, but capital would own it. That's a huge leap, but it seems to me it's the code of what he's doing now, still using, and we're giving it to him, the power to make an $800 billion fortune, but also to make a model of the way the world is going to work.
The Silicon Valley experience is quite important for Musk. It's a place that really does form him. It's interesting because when you think about Musk, he's both of and not of the Valley. I mean, he doesn't fit cleanly into tech, full stop. But certainly as a young man, he makes his first fortune in Silicon Valley, arrives in 1995, founds one and then another dot-com company, gets out of them at just the right time, and makes the money that he goes on to finance his future better-known ventures like Tesla and SpaceX with. But the Silicon Valley experience for us, we kind of extract two main themes that you articulated in that passage you quoted. The first is what we call state symbiosis.
Yes.
So we detect throughout Musk's career a keen attention to the state as a source of power and profit. That Musk has never been, in our view, a libertarian. He's never sought to escape or exit the state, but rather to fuse with the state, to take advantage of the opportunities that the state affords. And one of those, in the case of the 1990s, of course, is the fact of the internet itself, which would not have existed without billions of dollars of public funding. It was developed by military researchers starting in the late 1970s. But when you look forward into SpaceX, Tesla, and beyond, you see this recurring theme where the state is instrumentalized as a backstop, as a funder of basic research, and increasingly and most importantly, as a client, as a customer. The other piece of the Silicon Valley experience that's important for us is what we call the superset. So in 1998, Musk gives an interview to a journalist from NBC and says that the internet is dissolving all former types of media, such as broadcast, print, radio, television, into a new online realm and adding this additional layer of interactivity. And he describes this as the superset. And this is another articulation of this kind of cyborg idea that we've already been talking about.
Meaning cybernetic, but an organism, fusion of human mind with digital information.
Exactly. And in fact, organic metaphors are quite popular at the time. We talk about the work of Kevin Kelly, who is a very influential kind of theorist of this
Wired
new
magazine and
internet
all that.
culture, Wired magazine, precisely. And he's very fond of these organic metaphors. So here and elsewhere, Musk is participating in a broader current. But it's very important because this is a moment in which the internet is, in fact, absorbing these various kinds of media. And while the prediction sounds perhaps a bit strange in 1998, much of what he and his colleagues are saying, in fact, comes true over the subsequent decades. So this is also where we kind of need to be careful, where Musk is often considered by his critics to be a bullshit artist. We see it in a slightly more nuanced way, which is that he's someone who's very adept at securing investor confidence by telling fantastical stories about the future.
Yes.
But those stories need to have a kind of kernel of plausibility, and enough of them need to come true, not all of them, but portions of them, such that people actually do make money by placing bets on Musk. And that's a dynamic we describe as financial fabulism. And in fact, it has reaped enormous dividends, not just for Musk, but for his investors.
But is it fabulism or is it the ultimate realism? I mean, we're talking about a media world that's been transformed in my professional life. The newspapers are gone, essentially. Cronkite is gone. Huntley and Brinkley are gone. All these other media that we depended on and enjoyed and admired and went to work for 25, 30, 40, 50 years ago, they're gone. And he is explaining it. He anticipated. You come back to the theme that he believes in the future. Think about the future and know that it's real and it's going to be different.
Yeah, I mean, you point to, I think, one of the challenges of writing about Silicon Valley in a compelling way, which is you try to do, and we try to do, a materialist history of something that manifests as ever less material, right? I mean, it is the case that our experience of media, money, interactivity, privacy even has come up with this like liquid quicksilver kind of quality now, so that it seems we can, use the same small device to do all of the things in our lives, from entertainment to work to socializing to family, stewardship and so on. So how do you then rematerialize, bring back down to earth something that feels like it's in the cloud without actually missing the point that Ben is making, which is that it is by conjuring up the correct vision of the fantasy that can manifest and translate back into real hard currency and gains. Also, we're trying to address another common critique leveled at Musk, not just that he is a liar, but also on this point of the state and government, that he's just a kind of a parasite, that he is the beneficiary of kind of ill-gotten gains. All he's been doing is like ripping off taxpayers and freeloading on the government for as long as he's been in business. And we kind of try to nuance that, I would say, because one of the other isms I think we're separating Muskism from is crony capitalism, in the sense that crony capitalism implies a kind of baseline unproductivity, right? You have people who are, through their clientelist relationships to those in power, just keeping sectors from modernizing and just keeping, let's say, unproductive cement plant in place, or, keeping an inefficient way of pulling coal out of the ground to keep going. The thing about Musk, and he wouldn't be successful if he hadn't been able to do this, is at key points in his career, and arguably up to the present day, he's actually been able to increase state capacity through the products and services that he's innovated and offered. For example, SpaceX itself, which is founded in 2002, not coincidentally, in the first full year of the global war on terror, when Rumsfeld and other defense intellectuals have discussed the rollout of what they call network-centric warfare. What does that mean? It means fewer large invasions of ground troops, and instead small mobile units of special forces deployed around the world, because terrorists are everywhere, guided by communicating with satellites, backed up by munitions, things like Tomahawk cruise missiles, guided by satellites. Who's going to put those satellites into orbit? That's where SpaceX comes in. Musk steps in and says, I will build a company, and I'm going to use Silicon Valley agility, cost-cutting, nimbleness to put this stuff in the sky much cheaper than anyone has ever done before, from the old class of the primes. And what happens? He does it. He brings the cost of putting material into orbit down over 90% in the 2 decades of SpaceX's existence. And now he's responsible for over 95% of orbital launches. Does that mean that we are scarily dependent on one man and Musk? Absolutely. Does it mean, though, that he's just a parasite and a freeloader? Not exactly, right? Because the state is now able to do things it hadn't been able to do before because of the things that he has provided. Another example is Tesla itself. So Obama comes into power amidst the backlash against the Iraq war, and there's a big demand then to electrify the auto sector, move to renewables such that America does not have this obligation to intervene in places like the Middle East anymore to secure its oil supplies. How to get away from the Carter doctrine that securing oil somewhere is immediately American national security concern. Well, before fracking comes along and solves that problem, the push is for creating an electric vehicle market. And there aren't very many viable ones out there. So this upstart from California ends up getting an almost $500 million loan from the Department of Energy in 2009 from Obama as part of what you could call green industrial policy. It wasn't that different from what Biden was doing in the 4 years he was in office, giving private capital, de-risking their investment such that they can do something that's seen as socially productive.
Meanwhile, in the 90s, back in Silicon Valley, it seems to me Musk was learning a lot of things about politics and power from Peter Thiel, who had said the most innovative companies resemble feudal monarchies with the founder as king. Furthermore, a startup, as Peter Thiel taught him, is the largest endeavor over which you can have definite mastery. Startup CEOs, he said, are sovereigns in a wide open territory. And you say in the book, key insight into Muskism, the magic trick of the founder was to stand on a stage built by the state and to pull the future out of a hat.
The discussion of monarchy is quite interesting because
Right.
this description comes from Peter Thiel's very influential book, 0 to 1, which is blurbed by Musk and which offers, I think, a very, very powerful and vivid distillation of the Silicon Valley common sense, particularly in the kind of platform era as it congeals in the 2010s. And what Thiel is proposing is that the ideal startup is structured like a monarchy, as he understands the term, which is that you have a authoritative and dictatorial CEO who can execute very quickly and can transmit his decisions down to his subordinates without many layers of mediation. So there's a antipathy to the idea of middle management, which has been a long-standing feature of Silicon Valley since the 1960s. This emphasis on flatter organizations, team-based work. These are very old ideas within the Valley, but are taken up with fresh enthusiasm by the dot-com generation. Musk often talks about the signal-to-noise ratio within his firms, where signal is engineers and noise is managers.
And where Elon Musk himself doesn't hesitate to go down to the floor in the Tesla factory and say, you screwed up.
Precisely. And he, in fact, officially at Tesla is now the Techno King. That's his official title as of 2021. So he's very, among others within his milieu, very keen to find ways to express his authority without it being diluted through a network of middle managers who have to kind of translate his will down into the individual engineers. Now, as Quinn has been often pointing out, this is in fact a misunderstanding of monarchy as a historical form. That monarchy, in fact, often relied precisely on delegation. That feudalism, in fact, as a form, was characterized by what Perry Anderson calls the parcelization of sovereignty, that it's actually quite a decentralized social form that has to do with these kind of cascading layers of power that roll up to a monarch, but with many mediating layers. So here, as elsewhere, they are appropriating a concept they don't completely understand, but giving it their own kind of cybernetic interpretation.
I think it's worth dwelling on the king question because people who have just been paying casual attention to this topic over the last few years might have nevertheless gleaned two beliefs that they believe the tech people have. One is that there is something called disruptive innovation or creative destruction that characterizes the tech sector. In other words, there's always going to be some new technology that's going to come along and sweep away the incumbents. And the other is that they think that they're all kings. So how can these two things fit together? Kings are characterized by their solidity and their longevity, and then a spirit of moving fast and breaking things suggests that there is no solidity or longevity. And what it cashes out as the leaders, or the techno kings in Musk's sense, are very afraid of revolution, right? They're very afraid of the possibility of a new app, a new piece of coding, a new killer form of tech coming along and making them obsolete, taking away their market share, dethroning them from the top of the S&P 500. So they are ruthless about defending their monopoly.
Against unionized workers at some level, Ben, you've covered that.
Well, I think there is certainly a fear of their own workforce and a desire to discipline it. And arguably the tech layoffs that kicked off in 2022, which were perhaps even spearheaded by Musk himself at Twitter, where, of course, as you recall, after acquiring the company, he fires more than 80% of the workforce,
right.
Kind of gives let's say, a blank check to the tech sector more broadly in pursuing that. I think more recently, many of these layoffs have been conducted under the banner of AI. So the notion that tech CEOs will simply need fewer bodies to construct software, which gives them, I think, another pretext for disciplining labor, for speed up, for kind of expanding managerial prerogative. And Musk very much, I think, participates in that. So in that sense, there is a kind of internal threat and an external threat. Internally, one's workforce has to be managed. But externally, as Quinn is pointing out, there's always the fear that there's a scrappy upstart somewhere that is going to seize on some new sparkly piece of tech and scale up very quickly and displace the incumbent. Because, of course, the history of the tech industry is filled with such disruptions, right? I mean, it's a series of those.
I'm just so glad you brought up AI, because there's something about Muskism and AI that go together, and I want to figure that out. For one thing, Musk himself was a founding investor in OpenAI. He's now in battles with Sam Altman for the direction of AI, in which he got into it because he thought, wait a sec, somebody's got to save the human experience, the human genome from technology, and he comes across as a humanist in that respect. At the same time, we know that with or without his inhibitions, that we're entering an incredibly dangerous realm without our representative on that board. It's not just coincidence that we're entering the age of AI and also Muskism. How do they interact? And is he our friend or our worst enemy?
We were still figuring that out. I would tend to the latter. But I think it is necessary to understand this, not just to get why so many in the Silicon Valley leadership class ended up switching to the right in 2024.
Key question.
But also why the whole tech story seemed to transform so much in the course of only 10 years, from one where we were all being encouraged just to upload all our personal information, to do everything online in social media platforms, as in the model of Web 2.0, to the current era where it's all about generative AI, and the billboards along the 101 in the New York subway seem to be addressed to some strange middle manager and not the user, that it's about building out large-scale data centers. It's about doing stuff that might even lead to the obsolescence of many human workers. How did this sudden switch happen from you are the hero of the internet to you are maybe the discarded surplus labor of the AI era? And it all happened really within 10 years. Musk is again helpful as a character to track this transformation. 2015, he co-founds OpenAI with Sam Altman. And as you say, at that point, they are most concerned by the idea of a kind of runaway digital malevolent superintelligence. So the idea was you need to protect the human race from its potential transformation into gray goo or to paper clips and all of these scenarios that we've heard about over the years. But interestingly, the way you do that is not by preserving, as you sort of suggested, the sanctity of the human genome, but by fusing the human genome with technology to get out ahead of ahead of the digital superintelligence. And that is really the way he explains his move into the brain-computer interface sector with Neuralink, which he launches in 2017, not long after OpenAI, where he says basically to beat the evil digital superintelligence, we need to become the better human-machine symbiote AI. So it's us against the computers. You can think about that, us against Skynet in the Terminator reference that was so close to hand for him during those years. That persists for a few years, but when is the key turning point? This is one that I think, listeners and participants in general in America's political economy should
Dare I say citizens?
Mark on their calendar, citizens, you could say, is November 2022 with the rollout of ChatGPT, right? Which is the first very natural feeling, highly functional, user-facing large language model that is indeed, unveiled by OpenAI, the very company that nonprofit foundation that Musk had helped to found. So what happens after November 2022? The whole growth story changes in Silicon Valley. It's no longer the asset-light, capital expenditure-light world of apps. It is the world where you need a lot of land, you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of water, and you are hoping to be moving to a breakthrough of what they call artificial general intelligence, which in the terms that they trot out again and again to win investor confidence will make blue-collar labor obsolete through humanoid robots driven by LLMs and will make white-collar work obsolete by the hyping up of the AI agents of the kind that they've already started to roll out in the spaces of software engineering. So how does that change the story for politics and political economy? For Musk, immediately, he becomes concerned that these frontier LLMs, specifically that of OpenAI and Anthropic, have been infested with the progressive politics of the 2010s and have been shot through with radical feminism, anti-racism, the politics of Me Too, the politics of Black Lives Matter, and have become, in short, woke AIs. And this is a term that he is frequently using and happy to use. Therefore, he needs to accelerate his own AI development under the name XAI to provide an anti-woke alternative, prophylactic against the destructive progressive tendencies of his competitors. So as bizarre as it sounds, some of the richest people in the world and the largest private companies in the world are framing what's happening as a kind of a fight over not just truth, but human future on political grounds. So for Musk, this provides a very clear reason why he needs to side with MAGA, because MAGA is his solidaristic compatriots fighting against the woke threat. And for the non-MAGA or less virulently MAGA parts of the tech industry, even Altman himself, who is, much more liberal and Democrat aligned, it's nonetheless necessary to go along with MAGA for the reasons that you need that federal land opened up for data center construction. You need looser regulations on your sector. You need to have this effectively turned into the reservoir of capital, and both political and financial, to keep your growth model going.
How do we sort out what he calls the woke mind virus, the villainization of, shall we say, fashionable righteous thinking? Why aren't we talking about that all the time?
So the woke mind virus is a term that Musk first uses at the end of 2021 and is most closely associated with his turn to the right. So 2022 is typically the year that people pinpoint as the moment when Musk starts to promote right-wing viewpoints consistently on Twitter. And then, of course, he acquires Twitter and pushes the content of the site quite far to the right. Our interpretation of the term woke mind virus, which often elicits kind of a chuckle or an eye roll, is that it should be taken quite seriously. It should be taken quite literally, which is that for Musk, he does, as we've discussed earlier, have this meme theory of politics where people are essentially software that can be reprogrammed and are being networked together into what he describes as a giant cybernetic collective. So social media in particular is a vector for propagating certain viral ideas, viral in both senses, viral in the sense of social media popularity, but also viral in the sense of, a malevolent entity that can in fact enter and literally rewire a portion of your brain. He, I think, believes this quite concretely. So in his view, various social movements of the 2010s, really culminating with the George Floyd protests of 2020, but also, unionization efforts at his factories, the closure of the Tesla factory in Fremont by public health order during the coronavirus pandemic, the Biden administration's moves around regulatory and antitrust push associated with figures like Lena Khan, Biden's relatively pro-labor policy at the NLRB. I mean, the list goes on, that there are a number of developments that Musk finds both bewildering and threatening, which appear to endanger the sources of his wealth and power. And again, he's not alone in this. I mean, a number of figures in Silicon Valley within the leadership perceive these developments as threats. I mean, Mark Andreessen would be a classic example, right. And that helps motivate their turn to the right. Where Musk, I think, is distinctive is apprehending this through this computational term, that for him, the real problem is that the network has become infected, and therefore he needs to seize control of it and purify it of these mind viruses. And in fact, produce an anti-woke mind virus that can inoculate people within this networked cybernetic collective.
In which the argument is roughly, my mind virus is better than your mind virus.
It's a battle of mind viruses. It's interesting. So if you go back to the Richard Dawkins piece of the 1990s that introduces the concept of the mind virus, Dawkins is talking about religion, what he considers superstition. This is kind of a preview of his argument against religion that he makes. And what he's saying is that you can inoculate yourself against the mind virus of religious superstition through rationality. That reason is ultimately how you protect yourself from these mental contagions. That's actually not Musk's view. Musk's view is not that you can purify your mind of malevolent alien agents through rationality, but rather you need to displace it in favor of a different kind of mind virus. So there's not the same appeal to reason. And our case for why that is because he has such a thoroughly cybernetic and cyborg view of what society is, that because everything exists within these paradigms of code, there isn't a space of a kind of freely reasoning subject that's coming to conclusions in some kind of classical Enlightenment way. It's a much more engineer's view of what a human brain is.
Well, that's the org part of cyborg too, right? I mean, if you do allow for the persistence of the animal spirit, so to speak, inside of the network, which is very important for both the anime and cyberpunk culture that Musk draws on in his own way of thinking about how the way the internet works, is it isn't a space of pure rationality. It's also a space of the limbic system, right? It's a space of animal attraction, repulsion, desire. And so to do politics, either anti-woke or woke, you need to be able to play with those emotional impulses and instincts too, because they are online as well as the Spock-like, higher faculties.
We're going to have to come back around the whole matter of AI because it is the ultimate question and also enormously dangerous. Would Elon Musk, for example, treat the Enlightenment or Western history or Western civilization as a mind virus? He's set out to protect it in a way, but he's also slandering it in the most gross generalizations that you can imagine. Let me ask you 3 questions to close this session, and we'll come back to it all. But you spoke of fascism and communism as other dangerous ideas and movements that produced, among other things, communists and fascists. Do we have Muskists? And would you recognize one if you saw one coming down the street or, even in a deep conversation?
I like to think about how you might identify a Muskist. Cybertrucks, yeah. Perhaps a neural implant poking out from their skull from Neuralink. Something we've been thinking about is, who are the Muskists beyond Musk? And an answer that we've been converging on is Alexander Karp, the head of Palantir. And in particular, if you read his co-authored book, The Technological Republic, and many of the themes that we elucidate as the modules of Muskism are expressed, in fact, in Karp's book. The notion that the tech sector needs to fuse with the state to develop this symbiotic relationship in service of increasing its capacity so that it can protect the nation from a world of enemies in an era of instability. So Palantir is a company that in fact is co-founded by Peter Thiel, who Musk knew from the eBay days in the early 2000s, so actually just around the time that SpaceX is founded. And it offers data analytics and data integration services to both public and private sector actors, but has become particularly well known for its relationships with the intelligence community and the Pentagon. And in recent years has been doing extraordinarily good business. So if you recall some of the reporting on the AI tools that the Pentagon has been deploying in the Iranian conflict, its ability to essentially generate target lists and strike targets much more rapidly than it could in the past. This is a technology known as the Maven Smart System, MSS, and this is a technology that is in fact provided by Palantir. So they arguably more successfully than even Musk himself have really embodied this dynamic of state symbiosis where the purpose is not to diminish the sovereignty of the state. It's not exactly this neoliberal notion of a state being hollowed out, but rather it's the increase of state capacity through private means, so that a monopoly private provider is selling what we describe as sovereignty as a service, that the state can in fact increase its capacity to project sovereignty, particularly in coercive functions related to war making, but the cost of that added capacity is an increasing dependence on a small number of technology firms.
Interesting.
I mean, on the question of whether you'd know a Muskist if you saw them, beyond the brain-computer interface implant poking out from beneath the SpaceX hat or Boring Company hat, I think that anyone who would profess a belief in the idea that we are moving into a transformative, technologically advanced future in which the gains for that technology will be unequally distributed, and that is something that is just part of the bargain. There will be insiders and outsiders, and that the outsiders actually are sort of determined in advance, that we know that the outsiders to this technological super future will be people who are from racially marked, stigmatized groups. So Musk's worldview is by now extremely racialized and takes for granted that there is a world of would-be invaders, in some cases actual invaders who he's constantly ringing the alarm bell about, immigrants from non-white cultures and countries, that will have to be kept at bay and kept beyond the gates of either the nation or the compound, depending on the scale you're operating with. So if you have the vision of like a fortified future, which is constantly developing new technology, but only a few people get them, and then the wealth of that future society will be based on people's ability to bet on the future being speculated on by a small number of founder gods like Musk. If someone were to sit down over drinks and explain to me that that was their philosophy, and I'm sure we could throw a rock, it may be hard, but we could throw a rock and hit someone who thinks that way in the center of most major American cities, then I would call them a Muskist.
Can I quote you from your book? You together write, "The end goal of Muskism is a purified community defined by cultural and genetic membership in a white European West, garrisoned by superior technology, a fortress to protect the best of humanity from the worst. Harden your heart, harden your borders, and debug the codebase. If tolerance means the end of Western civilization, as Elon Musk posted last year, then we cannot be tolerant." That could be the frame of our next conversation. For now, two questions in one. Do we have a defense against Muskism? And do we need an alternative?
Well, I think this is where it's helpful to ask about Musk proper versus Muskism in general. So against Musk, I think we actually do have some pretty good levers of defense and indeed dethronement, let's say. His car company, Tesla, which he now describes as a robotics and AI company because it's being eclipsed globally by the Chinese company BYD in the EV sector, is on wobbly ground, right? It's not clear that that pillar of his empire will last too much longer, especially not in the vastly overvalued position it has. SpaceX is the most important part of the Musk empire. It will IPO likely next month at a projected valuation of between $1.5 and $2 trillion, which will be the largest IPO in history and immediately make it one of the top 10 largest valued public companies in the world, ahead even maybe of Meta. So that will obviously give a huge influx of capital to him. But the profitable parts of that company really are the rocket launch and, more than anything, the low Earth orbit satellites, which there were none of in the sky launched by Musk before 2019, and now of which there are over 11,000, which accounts for 70% of the satellites in the sky. This is actually very lucrative. There's a good revenue generation, which one can't say about all of Musk's products and services. But it's also open to competition and open to regulation. So should the US government, should other governments choose to boost Musk's competitors, then they're there. They're waiting in the wings, right? Bezos has his Blue Origin rocket system. He has LEO, his own low Earth orbit satellite system. The Europeans have Eutelsat, which could be a competitor and is a competitor to Starlink. So if you just think about Musk himself, I would say he's vulnerable. He's late on AI. He is unpopular. He may not be able to use lawfare and political alliances to keep himself locked into this monopoly position forever. If you talk about Muskism, however, it's a harder question, right? Because how much difference does it make, for example, if we switch from SpaceX to Blue Origin or from Starlink to Leo? The dynamics we're calling Muskism mostly remain in place, right? Absent some of the more extreme, extremely objectionable xenophobic rhetoric that he's embraced. But the idea of dependency on these single, centibillionaires, that dynamic remains. So I think that's where, the challenge is really one that falls on people with a deeper and more textured understanding of human reality than the mimetic, thin software politics that Musk preaches. And there I have a lot of confidence and even a sense of optimism. If you look at the last year through the lens of peaked and then declining MAGA tech alliance, which has now run itself into the ground almost literally with this foolhardy war in Iran. And then you look at the opposition in terms of Minneapolis successfully pushed back an incursion, which was very Muskist in its nature, these high-tech people entering with facial recognition software and clearing the streets. Compare that success in Minneapolis, compare the success of Mamdani in New York, right? These are moments of political imagination that are bottom up, and they're based often on mediation through technology still. People using Signal group chats, people are making TikToks in both cases, but in service of a different version of what collective life should look like.
Ben Tarnoff, what's your vision of an alternative to Muskism?
Well, I think when you pick apart the various modules of Muskism that we're attempting to describe in the book, one that looms large is state symbiosis, which we've been describing, which comes out of a series of political choices where the state, people within the state said, government is bureaucratic, it's sclerotic, it's slow. The real dynamism is in the private sector. Therefore, we need to find ways of bringing more private actors into the state. This is a pillar of Rumsfeld's approach to the war on terror. He expands the national security state quite precipitously, but he also privatizes it quite expansively. These are the years also of Blackwater, of Edward Snowden being not directly employed by the NSA, but as a contractor for Booz Allen Hamilton. These are, of course, also the years in which SpaceX is getting its start. It's kind of integral to Musk's future empire. But I think the point that we need to understand is that those were political choices, and you can choose differently. You can choose to invest in independent state capacity that does not rely on these predatory dynamics of sovereignty as a service. One of the moves that Mamdani has made in New York is, in fact, to cancel contracts that outsourced IT to third parties. He's saying, actually, we want to bring that kind of expertise in-house. That may feel like a small step, but that's actually, I think, the direction of travel towards something that looks quite different than Muskism. I think equally important is, what is this state capacity being expended towards? Many of the examples that we've been discussing have to do with the coercive functions of the state, really have to do with war and empire. So you could also imagine a vision in which we're trying to build up independent state capacity, we're trying to reduce our dependency on these monopoly private choke points, but we're also applying the power of the state toward very different ends. It's not about killing a bunch of people halfway across the world. It's actually about trying to ensure that people have the resources they need to lead self-determined lives. There's no reason that technology can't help facilitate that vision, but that has not been the emphasis of state capacity in recent years.
Ben Tarnoff, Quinn Slobodian, this is so much fun. We've got to get back to it. First question in the next round might be, forget reinvigorating government. What about reinvigorating politics, which is to say argument, interest, alliances, conversation, judgment, outside the government itself? But for the moment, this is a great privilege to talk with you about Muskism, and for sure, we've got to take it up again soon.
Look forward to it. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks a lot.
Quinn Slobodian is professor of world history, politics, and markets at Boston University. His last book was Hayek's Bastards, Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. Ben Tarnoff covers the mind sphere of Silicon Valley in a variety of publications and regularly for the New York Review of Books. Their new book together is Muskism, a guide for the perplexed. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. And leave a comment on what you're hearing. We're proud and happy to be founding members of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests, technology to politics to history and art at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did, and thank you.